The morning air over northern France carried the kind of stillness that misleads the unwary. A thin mist clung to the hedgerows, pooling in the ruts of the farm roads as if trying to hide the scars of the last 7 weeks. Along what had once been a quiet Norman lane, a German liaison officer named Heinrich Wolff stood beside the remains of a splintered orchard wall, listening for engines he could not yet see. He had grown accustomed to silence that felt temporary, a pause where one expected the earth itself to inhale before a calamity. Word had spread overnight that American armoured columns were shifting somewhere beyond the low ridge to the west, though no one could agree on the scale. Some swore it was another probing movement, a feint meant to scatter already fraying defences. Others whispered that it was something else entirely, something too large to be part of the rhythm of attack and counterattack the Germans believed they understood. Wolff knew only what he had seen, a sky that, days earlier. Before we jump back and tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. He still remembered the moment the bombardment started. The ground had trembled first, as if a storm were rolling across the fields. Then the roar came, a layered bellow of engines and explosions folding into each other until individual sounds dissolved into a single overwhelming force. Men flattened themselves in trenches not built for such punishment, clutching at their helmets as the air turned black with dust and shredded foliage. Wolff had thought, fleetingly, of the reports from St. Lo wildly exaggerated. He believed until he realized he was witnessing the same thing. Tanks were overturned, their chassis twisted like wreckage from a foundry explosion. Once the smoke thinned, the survivors moved through a landscape they no longer recognized. Craters had swallowed roads. Trays that had stood for centuries lay crushed into pulp. No map captured what remained. Yet the devastation had not been the true shock. The shock came later that afternoon, when runners brought word of a gap torn open along the line, a gap wider than any commander could explain, widening still with each passing hour. Patrols sent to assess the damage returned shaken, describing not small armoured groups moving cautiously through openings, but long columns of American armour, pushing with a speed that felt unnatural. Their descriptions varied wildly, but the undertone was the same. No one understood how so many enemy vehicles could appear so suddenly. Wolff, who had been trained in assessing enemy strength from limited signs, struggled to reconcile the reports. The bocage with deliberate, plodding momentum. The Germans believed they had learned the American pattern well enough to predict its pace, but pace no longer meant anything. He found himself recalling the confidence with which his commanders had spoken earlier that month. They had described the Americans as methodical but unimaginative, a force that could be pinned and bled so long as German armour held the critical points. Even Hitler had echoed the sentiment, claiming the enemy lacked the boldness to exploit any breakthrough. Standing beside the shattered orchard wall, Wolff wondered if any of them would have repeated those words now. The truth moved like a shadow across the countryside. The Americans had changed. The 7 weeks of hedge fighting had not exhausted them. They had learned from it, adjusted to it, and now moved with a kind of mechanical certainty that defied the German assumptions. Whatever the Germans thought they knew about American equipment, about their armour and their logistics, felt suddenly and violently outdated. Later that day, Wolff was summoned to a forward command post hastily relocated into the cellar of a ruined farmhouse. The air inside smelled of earth, sweat, and the faint mineral tinge of powdered plaster drifting down from the ceiling. Field telephones crackled constantly, voices layered with static, as officers tried to piece together a picture of the battlefield. Maps covered the table at the centre of the room, though their neat lines and coloured markers bore little resemblance to the chaos unfolding outside. When Wolff entered, he recognised General Fritz Bayerlein, his face lined with dust and fatigue, speaking in low, nearly disbelieving tones. Bayerlein's division, once one of the elite armoured units, had been mauled beyond recognition. His report was blunt. He had nearly nothing left. Tanks were gone, communications severed, infantry scattered or buried under the collapsed world created by the bombing. It was the kind of report no commander wished to give. But it was only the beginning. As Wolff listened, he noted the way officers tilted their heads each time distant engines rumbled. It had become a reflex, an involuntary measurement of nearing danger. Hours earlier, such sounds signaled the possibility of a small armoured patrol. Now, each whisper of machinery suggested something far larger. Rumours spread faster than confirmations. Some claimed that the Americans had committed their entire armoured reserves. Others insisted reinforcements had been arriving by the hour, funneling through breaches in the German line without pause. None of these claims could be verified. But somehow, within the cramped cellar, the shape of the truth emerged. The Americans were moving with numbers the Germans had neither expected nor prepared for. Wolff stepped aside as a staff officer marked new positions on the map with a trembling hand. Each symbol seemed to represent American forces appearing where, the day before, they had not been. Wolff felt as though he were watching a dam rupture on paper, floodwaters sweeping through every gap. When orders finally came to withdraw, orders issued only because holding the line any longer meant outright annihilation, the relief among the officers was carved through with dread. Withdrawal meant movement, and movement meant exposure. Exposure meant air power. Everyone in the cellar understood what that implied, but remaining meant erasure. He joined a column pulling back through lanes that hours earlier had been choked with smoke so thick it turned day into twilight. Now the haze lifted just enough to reveal the smouldering skeletons of tanks lining the road. The crews of the few remaining vehicles scanned the skies nervously, expecting the predatory dive of Allied fighter bombers at any moment. Infantry moved along the ditches, many still half deaf from the bombardment. No one spoke above a murmur. Sound carried too easily, and silence felt safer. Wolff studied each passing vehicle, counting without meaning to. Half-conscious, he tried to measure what remained of the division. The numbers did not make sense. There were too few tanks, too few supply vehicles, too few men. The division had existed on paper, as so many German units now did, preserved in reports but not in reality. As the column crept forward, the faint rumble of engines drifted from the west again. Men tensed. Some raised binoculars. Wolff caught a glimpse between the hedgerows. He could not count the vehicles, could hardly distinguish shapes at that distance, but the scale unsettled him. Reports had already mentioned American tanks advancing 40 kilometers in only a few days, racing with a speed that defied what the Germans had believed possible. Now he saw the physical proof. By evening, Wolff reached a temporary rest point where officers gathered around another battered map table. The mood was taut, brittle. A messenger had just delivered the newest directive from higher command. An attack was to be prepared, an immediate counterstrike meant to seal the breach, cut off the American spearheads, and restore the line. The room fell silent as the order was read, each sentence more disconnected from reality than the last. The commanders exchanged looks of disbelief, though none voiced it openly. The directive spoke of armoured divisions to be regrouped, of concentrated strikes to be launched within days. Yet everyone present knew the divisions named in the order no longer existed in any meaningful sense. Their tanks were wreckage littering the roads. Their infantry were dead, missing, or lost in the chaos. Wolff watched as a colonel attempted to argue politely with the messenger, explaining that the divisions being summoned did not have the fuel, the cohesion, or even the physical presence to mount such an attack. The messenger simply pointed to the signature beneath the directive. The order came directly from the highest authority. Whether it was possible no longer mattered. The order would be attempted. Reality would bend, or the men ordered to enact it would be broken trying. That night, Wolff lay in a shallow depression beneath an overgrown hedgerow, staring at a sky that glowed faintly from distant fires. He could not sleep. His mind returned to the moment he had caught sight of the dust clouds rising from the western horizon. Whatever the exact number of American tanks, whatever the specific composition of their forces, the impression left on him was unmistakable. It had been wrong in scale, wrong in speed, wrong in the very premise that enemy resources were limited in any way comparable to their own. They had underestimated not merely the machines, but the system behind them. The capacity to replace losses, to surge forward, to overwhelm gaps not over days, but in hours. When dawn approached, the rumble of engines returned closer this time, deeper, a vibration that passed through the ground before reaching the ears. Men rose slowly, resigned. The order to counterattack had not been rescinded. Whatever moved beyond the hedgerows would soon collide with the remnants of the German line. Wolff readied himself, though readiness felt hollow. He had seen the aftermath of the bombing. He had heard commanders describe divisions erased from existence. He had watched the landscape itself reshaped by explosions that turned trees into splinters and tanks into burning husks. And through it all, the Americans advanced relentlessly, columns appearing with a frequency and abundance he could not quantify. As Wolff tightened the straps of his gear, he glanced once more toward the horizon. The mist had lifted, revealing narrow rays of early sunlight glinting off distant shapes, metal shapes, many of them. He felt a familiar tightening in his chest, not fear alone, but the dawning recognition that the picture the Germans had drawn of this enemy had been composed of assumptions rather than observations. Now the true scale stepped into the open, unmistakable even at a distance. Whether they were dozens, hundreds, or more, Wolff could not say. But he knew instinctively that whatever number he might guess would be too small. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, to subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. And for the first time since arriving in France, he understood that the war he thought he was fighting, the war of careful calculations and managed defences, no longer existed. A new truth had arrived in the form of engines and steel, and it was coming toward him with the certainty of a tide no order could reverse. The first shells fell before Wolff could fully orient himself. They struck somewhere along the tree line, muffled by the thick hedge roots, sending clods of earth drifting through the air like dust shaken from an old blanket. Men instinctively ducked, though the rounds were still probing fire, feeling for positions rather than trying to destroy them outright. It was a kind of herald, a warning that the armoured shape pushing through the countryside was correcting its aim. Moments later, the rattle of automatic weapons joined in, echoing off the narrow lane as German squads braced for the inevitable. The division commander tried to gather what remained of his staff beneath the partial shelter of an overturned wagon. His voice carried the strained steadiness of a man refusing to acknowledge how little control he still had. Orders were issued to reposition anti-tank weapons, though almost none remained. Mines were to be laid, though the supply had been nearly exhausted days earlier. A fallback position was designated, though everyone knew that the hedgerow terrain left little space to retreat cleanly. Even so, a semblance of structure mattered. Soldiers responded better to orders than to silence. Wolff moved among the scattered men, repeating the instructions, helping to drag a damaged machine gun nest into a less exposed corner of the ditch. Nearby, a young sergeant struggled to position a Panzerfaust in the direction of the oncoming rumble. His hands trembled despite his attempts to steady them. Wolff offered a curt nod, hoping it would convey reassurance he did not feel. The sergeant nodded back with a quick jerk of his chin, swallowing hard. Then the sound changed. It deepened, not merely louder but fuller, richer, as though the earth itself joined to amplify the advance. Engines of different pitches merged into a single, relentless growl. The Americans were approaching in numbers no hedgerow could disguise. Even before they appeared, the very air gave them shape. Leaves quivered on the branches, dust lifted in thin threads along the ground. The first tank crested the rise at the end of the lane, its silhouette emerging from sunlight that flashed off its armour. They did not advance in a cautious stagger, but in steady procession, as if the battlefield ahead had already been decided. Wolff exhaled slowly. Whatever he had glimpsed the day before had not been an illusion. This was scale that dwarfed what German commanders insisted was possible. The sergeant fired the first shot. The Panzerfaust streaked across the lane, trailing a hiss of smoke, and struck the front glacis of the lead tank. It produced a sharp burst of flame, a flare of sparks, but the tank did not stop. It lurched slightly, corrected, and continued forward without hesitation. Another rocket fired from deeper in the hedgerows arced high before crashing against a second vehicle, but again the effect seemed minimal. Wolff felt a sickening twist in his gut. The weapons were too few, too scattered, and many of the shots were fired at ranges too long for reliability. They had been designed for close ambushes, not open-lane confrontations against an armoured column pushing with unstoppable momentum. Machine gun fire erupted from the avenue of American tanks. Tracers tore across the hedgerows, shredding branches and kicking up dirt. German soldiers ducked deeper into their hiding places, clutching at rifles and carbines as the volume of fire multiplied. Wolff shouted for men to hold position, though the words felt futile even as he yelled them. Several soldiers were already crawling backward, trying to slide deeper into folds of ground where they might avoid being cut down. The command to counterattack, once merely unrealistic, now felt grotesquely detached from the scene unfolding. A mortar team stationed behind the ditch attempted to launch a volley, but a burst of heavy-caliber fire found them before they could range their tubes. Wolff glanced back to see two of the crew crumple, movements torn away mid-gesture. The third tried to drag the tube to safety, but another burst struck the ground near him in a shower of soil. He fell without sound. The tanks pressed forward with methodical certainty, maneuvering past the burning wrecks of vehicles destroyed in earlier airstrikes. Their sides bore streaks of dust and mud from the rapid advance that had carried them through the torn-open German line. Some infantry moved alongside them, silhouettes darting between patches of ground, advancing with a discipline that marked weeks of fighting in cramped hedgerow country. These were not the inexperienced troops the Germans had once expected to wear down. They moved with practiced pace, rifles raised, attention sharp. Wolff felt movement beside him. One of the soldiers, a boy, really was trying to quietly retreat through a break in the hedge. The lieutenant in charge of the position barked at him, but fear had already overtaken discipline. The boy fled, low to the ground, scrambling through branches. Wolff closed his eyes briefly. He did not have the heart to chase him. Courage had become a resource as scarce as ammunition. A tank shell crashed into the hedgerow a dozen meters to Wolff's left, blowing open a cavity in the earthen wall. The explosion punched the air from his lungs. Dirt rained down, clinging to his face and uniform. When he regained his breath, the lane was filled with smoke and fragments. The sergeant with the Panzerfaust lay motionless, his weapon shattered beside him. Another tank rolled forward, pushing debris aside with its tracks, its turret swinging to the right to engage a separate cluster of defenders. The German line did not break so much as dissolve. Men slipped away in pairs and singles, retreating not by coordinated command but by instinct. The commander tried to rally them, but the sound of engines swallowed his voice. Wolff saw him stand, waving his arms, before a burst of fire cut through the space around him and drove him back to cover. Wolff crawled along the ditch, moving parallel to the road, searching for a position not yet overrun. He knew retreat was the only surviving option, though he feared that even retreat would not guarantee safety. The Americans were moving too quickly, pushing forward with an urgency that left little time for German forces to regroup. His breath came in ragged bursts. He felt the tremor of tank treads through the ground beneath him, a steady pulse edging closer. Reaching a bend in the ditch, Wolff scrambled up the slope and through a patch of briars into a narrow field. Smoke rolled along the far hedge, drifting in a lazy veil. He paused only long enough to confirm no enemy soldiers were visible before sprinting toward a cluster of battered farm buildings. Behind him, the battle in the lane continued with unrelenting violence. He reached a stone outbuilding just as another wave of machine gun fire tore across the field. Pressing his back to the wall, he inhaled sharply, trying to steady his breathing. Two other Germans were already inside, crouched behind shattered wooden beams. They nodded silently, eyes wide. One clutched a rifle with white-knuckled tension. The other held a field, dressing against a bleeding shoulder. "Any officers?" Wolff whispered. Both men shook their heads. He peered through a gap in the stones. American infantry were advancing along the hedge line now, spreading out, weapons raised. Their coordination was unmistakable. The bombardment, the breakthrough, the speed of the armoured push, none of it had overextended them. Instead, it had propelled them. Wolff found himself thinking again of the maps he had seen in the cellar command post. The symbols marking American positions had seemed excessive, even as they were drawn. Now, watching the flood pour through the countryside, he understood that the estimates had been conservative. What the Germans had dismissed as exaggerations were merely early glimpses of a far larger surge. He motioned for the two soldiers to follow him. They slipped out the back of the building, keeping low as they crossed a narrow meadow. A line of trees loomed ahead, offering a possible path of escape. But as they neared the shade, the faint sound of engines rose from the far side, more approaching vehicles. Not from the lane they had fled, but from yet another direction. Wolff froze, eyes widening. The American advance was not simply pushing through a single breach. It was expanding, widening its front, consuming territory faster than word of its movements could travel. "Back," he whispered urgently. "We'll cut through the orchard." The men followed without question, circling toward a stand of apple trees, scorched from previous shelling. The ground was uneven, pocked with shallow craters. Wolff stumbled more than once, catching himself with outstretched hands. The distant rumble of armor seemed omnipresent now, filling the air from multiple directions. As they moved into the orchard, a sudden crack split the air, a rifle shot. Wolff dropped instinctively, rolling, behind a low stone terrace. The two soldiers followed suit, sliding into cover. He raised his head cautiously. At the far edge of the orchard, American infantry were sweeping through the trees. Their silhouettes appeared briefly between the trunks before disappearing again. The Germans waited motionless, hoping the search would pass them by. Wolff listened to the rustling of boots in grass, the clipped murmurs of English orders, the metallic click of weapons being checked. Minutes crept by in agonizing slowness. One of the Americans passed so close Wolff could hear his breathing. Another stepped on a fallen branch that snapped like bone. Finally, the footsteps receded. Wolff exhaled shakily. He gestured to the others, pointing toward a gap in the orchard wall that led to a wooded ravine. With luck, they could slip away and rejoin whatever fragments of their unit still existed. They moved cautiously, stepping over roots and debris, keeping low. But just as they neared the gap, a mechanical clatter erupted from outside the orchard. Another engine, closer now. A second engine joined it, then a third. Wolff peeked through the brush and saw the unmistakable hulls of additional American vehicles rolling into view, armored half-tracks this time, followed by jeeps carrying more infantry. They were everywhere. The idea of a narrow breakthrough the Germans might still contain had evaporated. This was expansion, exploitation, movement foiled by a logistics system the Germans had never fully appreciated. Earlier, Wolff had believed the bombardment was the worst of it. Now he understood the bombing had been only the opening chapter. The true force, the armoured spear thrusting through the shattered German line, was something greater, something the High Command had insisted was impossible. He felt a strange sense of detachment, as if witnessing not his own war but a lesson unfolding. Everything they had believed about American strength had been shaped by weeks of hedgerow fighting, weeks in which German tanks had held key points, weeks in which they had interpreted the slow advance as proof of American limitations. But the Americans had not been limited. They had been preparing, and when the breakthrough came, they advanced not with exhaustion, but with precision and speed that made a mockery of German calculations. Wolff motioned for the two soldiers to follow him deeper into the ravine. They slid down the slope, half running, half stumbling. At the bottom, hidden among thick undergrowth, they finally paused. The sounds above were muffled now, though still constant. Engines, voices, the distant crack of gunfire, all blending into the sound of a battlefield shifting irrevocably. One of the soldiers looked at Wolff, his expression hollow. "What do we do?" Wolff did not answer immediately. He thought of the orders to counterattack, the divisions named in the directive that no longer existed. He thought of Bayerlein's grim report, of units described as present only on paper. He thought of the tanks rolling through the countryside with a momentum that no command order could slow. And he thought of the maps shaded with enemy positions spreading like ink across a page. "We survive," Wolff said quietly. "That's all that's left for us now." The men nodded, though neither seemed reassured. The truth sat heavy in the ravine with them. The battle ahead would not be a stand or a counter-strike. It would be a flight. A scattering of remnants before an advance the Germans had failed to comprehend until it was too late. Above them, the engines roared again, closer, louder, inexorable. Wolff closed his eyes briefly, absorbing the sound. It no longer felt like a distant threat. It felt like the new shape of the war itself. And it was still coming. For hours, the ravine shielded them from sight, though not from sound. The noise above never ceased. Engines rolled past in long, unbroken waves, sometimes close enough that Wolff felt faint vibrations in the soil. The Americans were not rushing blindly. They were advancing with a confidence that suggested no expectation of serious resistance. Each passing column, each engine note, each clipped order drifting down the slope underscored the same truth. The Germans no longer controlled the tempo of anything. As the afternoon light filtered through the branches overhead, Wolff studied the two soldiers who had remained with him. Their exhaustion had deepened into a hollow quiet. The wounded one had retied his bandage, though blood still seeped slowly through the cloth. He refused to complain. The other soldier kept scanning the ridgeline as if expecting an opportunity to break free to safety, though there was none. Wolff recognized both reactions. He had seen them across the division, men who had endured too much, and men who refused to accept what endurance meant now. "We can't stay here," Wolff finally said. His voice was barely above a whisper, but both men straightened. "If the ravine becomes part of their route, we'll be trapped." The unwounded soldier nodded. "Where do we go?" Wolff looked down the length of the ravine. Thick brush, scattered stones, a narrow run of exposed rock. Beyond it, the ground sloped upward into another set of hedged fields. He hadn't seen that area since the bombardment. It might be clear, or it might be swarming with American patrols. But if they remained in the ravine, the noose would tighten. "We move northeast," Wolff said, "toward the wooded crest, slowly, and we avoid all roads." They began climbing, using roots and hutting rocks for handholds. The wounded soldier hissed with pain each time he pulled with his injured arm, but he did not slow. Wolff felt the strain in his own limbs, a heaviness amplified by hours of tension. The ravine walls funneled the noise above, sometimes creating the illusion of tanks directly overhead, sometimes masking distance altogether. Passed across the crest, uncertain if those above were American scouts or the remnants of another broken German unit. Neither possibility brought comfort. At last, they reached the top. The hedgerow ahead bore fresh scars, branches snapped clean, earth gouged by spinning tracks. The field beyond lay quiet for the moment, though smoke drifted lazily from the far side. Wolff signaled for the others to duck low as they crossed. Each step felt exposed, as though eyes watched from hidden corners of the field. But they reached the opposite hedge without incident and slipped into the shade beneath its tangled branches. Fallen limbs, underbrush, and uprooted trees formed a jagged landscape that concealed movement as effectively as it impeded it. They weaved through the debris, stepping carefully to avoid giving away their position. For a short while, they encountered no sounds of battle, no engines, no gunfire, only the intermittent crackle of distant fires. It was almost enough to imagine a pocket of calm. Almost. A sudden, distant boom shattered the quiet. Not close, but powerful. The ground seemed to shudder faintly beneath their feet. Seconds later, another boom rolled across the countryside like thunder. Then a third. Wolff halted. He knew the pattern instantly: artillery, firing in deep, steady rhythm. But this was not German artillery. Their batteries had been torn apart or scattered days earlier. The Americans were continuing their push, softening targets far ahead. It meant the advance was still expanding, still accelerating. The wounded soldier leaned against a tree, breathing hard. How far has it gone? Wolff did not answer. He didn't know. No one inside this broken pocket of land did. Their maps were meaningless now. Distances had become fluid, shaped by the speed of mechanized movement and by the collapse of German formations that existed only on orders and reports, but not in the fields where they were supposed to fight. "Keep moving," Wolff said after a moment. "We put distance between us and whatever is coming next." As they moved, Wolff's thoughts drifted back to the cellar command post, the dim light, the dust settling from the ceiling, the strained look in every officer's eye as reality slipped further from their grasp. He could still hear the disbelief in Bayerlein's voice as he described the annihilation of his division. He could still hear the muttered panic when the bombardment shattered the front, and he could still feel the weight of that unrealistic directive ordering a counterstrike that could no longer exist. If the High Command had seen what he saw now, if they had stood in this very patch of forest, hearing the steady, unbroken advance of American forces from 3 directions, they would finally understand the magnitude of their miscalculation. But by now, Wolff suspected, even that realization would arrive too late to matter. A twig snapped behind them. Wolff spoon, rifle raised. The unwounded soldier did the same. For a moment, they waited in utter stillness. A bird flitted from a low branch, startled into flight. Silence settled again. Then a low whisper, "Kameraden?" A figure emerged from behind a tangle of brush, another German soldier, his uniform scorched, his helmet dented. He raised both hands slowly. His face bore the hollow-eyed exhaustion Wolff had seen in so many others who survived the bombing. Wolff lowered his rifle slightly. "Where are you coming from?" "East of here," the soldier said, voice raw. "Our group broke apart after the last attack. Some went north, others south. I don't know what happened to them." Wolff gestured for him to join. "We're heading northeast, away from the roads." The newcomer nodded gratefully and fell in with them. For a few minutes, the group moved with renewed purpose. But soon, the terrain forced them into a narrow gap between fallen trees. Branches scraped against their uniforms as they climbed over twisted roots. Each movement felt heavier than the last. They paused in a clearing where sunlight filtered through a canopy of shattered branches. The new soldier sank against a stump, wiping grime from his face. "Did you see how many?" he asked quietly. "The Americans?" Wolff hesitated. "Enough." "It felt like they were everywhere," the soldier murmured. "Tanks, trucks, infantry, like they had no end." Wolff met his gaze. "They don't move like they're tired." "They move like they've been waiting for this," the soldier said. Wolff almost replied, but a new sound reached them, voices, English speaking, faint but getting closer. They scattered into the thickest part of the undergrowth, crouching low. Through gaps in the leaves, Wolff could see shadows moving along the tree line. American infantry, sweeping the woods in measured steps. Their discipline was unmistakable, even at a distance. They advanced with coordination that belied the chaos of the shattered battlefield behind them. For several minutes, the Germans remained motionless as the patrol passed within 20 meters. Wolff held his breath, feeling the slow pulse of fear thud in his chest. A boot crunched leaves mere steps from their hiding place. A soldier's silhouette paused, scanning the surroundings. Wolff gripped his rifle tightly, though firing would have been meaningless. One shot would bring dozens. At last, the Americans drifted further downslope. The German group waited long after their voices faded before emerging from cover. "We need deeper concealment," Wolff said. "They're sweeping everything." They climbed toward a thicket of young trees, dense enough to break line of sight. The rise beyond it led to another field, one that appeared unscarred, at least from their vantage point. But as they crested the slope, a distant column of dust caught Wolff's attention. More vehicles. The Americans were not merely pushing on one axis, they were spreading across the countryside in a broad fan, sealing every gap, filling every corridor of retreat. One of the soldiers muttered a faint curse under his breath. "They've cut the roads," Wolff said quietly. "All of them. No wonder nothing is regrouping," the wounded man whispered. He pressed a hand against his shoulder, grimacing. Every path is blocked before we even reach it. Wolff scanned the horizon. The countryside had become a battlefield of American movement. German resistance had fractured into scattered pockets, each isolated by speed and relentless pressure. From here, they were not a force. They were fragments. "Look there," the unwounded soldier said suddenly. Wolff followed his pointing finger. In the far distance, barely visible through heat shimmer, a line of smoke rose in the shape of burning vehicles, an entire column, destroyed or abandoned. German, unmistakably. The remnants of another unit that had tried to break free, only to be overtaken. Wolff exhaled slowly. For more than an hour they threaded through the woods, avoiding open ground except when absolutely necessary. Each time they crossed a field, their movements were quick, low, tense. Each time they re-entered the trees, relief washed over them until the next sound of engines reminded them that wooded cover was temporary, never secure. Eventually, they reached a hollow shaded by towering oaks. It felt deeper, safer. Wolff allowed the group to rest. They sank to the ground, breathing heavily. The newcomer broke the silence first. "Do you think command knows?" Wolff closed his eyes briefly. He pictured the headquarters behind the line's officers bent over maps, some refusing to accept reports, others too afraid to deliver them. He thought of orders built on assumptions that were crumbling under the advance. "I think they know what they want to know," Wolff said. "And what they want to know isn't this." A bitter smile touched the soldier's lips. "Then they know nothing." "No," Wolff said quietly. "They know too late." The group fell silent. After a few minutes, the wounded soldier shifted. "What happens to us?" Wolff looked at him. There was no anger in the question, only exhaustion. "We keep going," he said, "until we find a gap, a weakness, a place the Americans haven't filled. And if there is none?" Wolff hesitated. The truth hung between them like smoke. The Americans moved as though absence was their rarest weakness. Each new wave filled the spaces between the last. Each new column connected the advance into something continuous, fluid, impossible to outrun. "If there is none," Wolff said, "then we wait for night. And try. Again." No one argued. They simply nodded, accepting the answer because no other existed. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows through the trees. Wolff stood slowly, stretching the stiffness from his legs. "We move before dusk. If darkness catches us here, we're trapped." They gathered their remaining strength and pressed on once more. As they advanced through the hollow, the sound of engines returned louder this time, unmistakably close. Wolff tensed, raising a hand for silence. The others froze. Through the trees, he glimpsed moving shapes, vehicles threading along a dirt approach path that paralleled the woods. Not tanks this time, but transport vehicles and jeeps. More infantry, more supplies, reinforcements, fresh ones. Wolff stared at the column and felt something inside him shift. The speed of the American advance alone had been overwhelming. But this fresh reserves arriving, while the initial assault still surged forward, drove home the reality in a way nothing else had. This was not simply a breakthrough. This was acceleration. "What do we do?" whispered the newcomer. Wolff watched the unbroken line of vehicles, stretching far beyond the trees. It felt endless. "We stay alive," Wolff said quietly. "That is all that remains." They turned away from the road, deeper into the wood's fading light, as the American engines rolled past like the sound of an approaching future. And nothing in the forest was still. Night came without ceremony, no stars, no clear sky, only a heavy darkness thickened by drifting smoke. The forest absorbed it, turning every branch into a silhouette and every shadow into something uncertain. Wolff led the group through the undergrowth as quietly as they could manage, though exhaustion made their movements clumsy. Leaves brushed their uniforms with faint whispers. Twigs snapped despite their caution. Every sound felt too loud. The night carried distant motors, faint but constant, like a heartbeat pulsing across the countryside. Even in darkness, the advance hadn't stopped. "Careful," Wolff whispered. "We move slower from here." They crept toward a narrow ridge. The path was steep, littered with stones loosened by shellfire. At the top, the trees parted just enough to reveal a sliver of countryside below. Fires still burned in the distance, orange blooms shifting behind low smoke. Tracer rounds occasionally stitched the air far from their position. Beyond it all, the faint gleam of headlights moved in long, sinuous lines that seemed to flow without interruption. Wolff felt the others step beside him. No one spoke. It looked endless because it was. Columns feeding columns, movement feeding movement. A rhythm the Germans could no longer disrupt. The newcomer's voice finally broke the quiet. "There's no gap," he murmured. "No opening at all." Wolff did not disagree. The roads were gone, the lanes filled, the fields patrolled. Even the forests, their last refuge, were being probed by steady sweeps. But he could not tell the men that survival depended on motion. So long as they believed there was somewhere to run, they would keep running. "We go down the far slope," Wolff said. "We stay deep in the cover and wait for a shift. There will be one eventually." He did not know whether he believed it, but the nods he received meant the men needed the possibility as much as breath. They descended into thicker woods, where the darkness became almost tactile. Branches clawed at their sleeves. The ground dipped and rose unpredictably. More than once, Wolff had to stop and orient himself by touch alone. The engines remained audible, humming like distant machinery in an underground cavern. Then, faint footsteps rustled ahead. Wolff raised his hand sharply. The group froze. The footsteps grew clearer, measured, cautious, accompanied by the soft clink of equipment. English words followed, carried on the wind, not shouting, not hurried. A patrol moving with full confidence that the night belonged to them. Wolff motioned the group lower, pressing into the cold earth beneath a tangle of brush. The patrol passed just beyond the trees, dark shapes moving with steady assurance. Only when their footsteps faded did Wolff breathe again. "They're everywhere," the wounded soldier whispered. Wolff nodded once. "Which is why we keep moving." And into the deeper dark, they went, small figures pressed between a collapsing world behind them and an advancing one ahead, searching for a silence that no longer existed. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.